New questions tonight about whether Donald Trump's Department of Justice will take full responsibility for what we've now seen as one of the greatest law enforcement failures of the Trump era, the apparent suicide of the high-profile prisoner Jeffrey Epstein. Today, the Attorney General is taking related action, reassigning the warden who was at the federal detention center where Epstein died and placing two other staffers on leave. Mr. Barr, though, continues to ignore how he and Donald Trump are, of course, in charge of all this and responsible for that prison. Take a look at the New York Times report that one of the two officers charged with checking on Epstein the night of his very death was actually not a, quote, full-fledged correctional officer. Now, we don't know from that reporting yet why one of the guards wasn't apparently a full-blown guard. Here is some broader context, though, that we have been reporting on. Prison employees have been warning publicly about what they say are these dangerously understaffed prisons. Workers forced to serve 16-hour days, and prisons regularly compelling teachers, nurses, secretaries, or other support staff members to step in and basically work as corrections officers. That can stoke a dangerous situation, and these employees are saying it's a product of policy, of understaffing, of, yes, the Trump administration, which has famously bragged about limiting federal spending, having acting secretaries, leaving positions vacant, and even instituting department-wide hiring freezes. I'm joined now by a veteran prosecutor who knows many of these issues, Paul Henderson. Thanks for coming on the beat, sir.
Happy to be back, Ari. How are you?
I'm good. We look at this issue, and as with any individual case, journalists, lawyers, viewers will all agree you can't immediately know the full causality in the exact situation, and that's what reporting and investigations are for. Right. But in a broader sense, do you think this case could shine a light on the potential problems and the potential linkages with how these prisons are being run by Bill Barr and Donald Trump?
Well, I think it already has. I mean, these are tough jobs that many of these wardens have, trying to balance out costs against public safety. But it's clear from this case, and I think we're having more discussions now that, you know, I have concerns, as well as many others do, about the standard of care in government facilities and what this means for the Trump administration and whether or not there's a shift in priorities through default economics into privately for-profit institutions. I mean, that's the question that's being raised when we're looking across the country at how these institutions are being run, and that's obviously at the forefront now that we're talking about this big case that everyone is talking about. And this is a real tragedy that should not have happened and could have been prevented. And that's why we're seeing some of the actions that we're seeing now. And all of this is going to be under review about what took place in that institution and why, although we can presume some of the why is going to be associated with shortfalls in staffing and costs.
And whatever, as you say, whatever that picture looks like, whether there's going to be accountability, it's the job of the Attorney General and the President to say the buck stops here. These reassignments may or may not be a necessary corrective. I think that's in the mix. But as of tonight, Mr. Barr has not taken full responsibility. He left this acting official in charge of the whole Bureau of Prisons, the deputy position vacant, as we've been reporting. And then you get into the receipts, and I happen to know you a little bit, so I know you like evidence and receipts. It's not about people's general ideas about what was Obama like, what's Trump like, who gives more speeches about law and order. Some of this comes down to the minutia. The almost dry aspect. I want you to look at this and then tell us the dry aspect of who is actually serviceably running the government. Look at how Obama did this. They had over 2,000 additional correction officers hired. Not because Obama did or didn't like corrections officers, but because he dealt on a policy level with running the federal government. And with Donald Trump, it's about 372. Your view?
My view is that there are shortfalls that are now systemic in these institutions. And so when we examine why the standard of care is what it is, you can't have that conversation without evaluating what these budgets are, what these staffing issues are, and that's exactly what this case is bringing to the forefront. We know the measurable shortfalls in this case with Epstein already from the press. We know that he wasn't being monitored on the schedule that he should have been monitored. We know that people were moved in and out of his room. We also know that he ended up dead. I mean, that's a real issue.
And final question. if he did commit suicide, which is DOJ's current statement, they say, quote, apparent suicide, do you think he did that because he saw no way out and just was too much of a coward to face the rest of the process?
I don't know that we're ever going to get the answer to that question, but I do know that his death is going to open the door to a lot of lawsuits, both against the correctional facility, but also in the secondary aspect, in the civil courts against many of his victims that are now going to be suing his estate, because the criminal court against him, the criminal case against him may go away, but the civil cases are just beginning, and the estate is going to be being both proactive against the correctional facility and trying to say that the standards weren't met, and also having to pay out whatever money they could be liable for in the suits that are coming from a lot of his other victims and all of the unanswered questions about what can be proven or shown from his behavior before he died, whether or not the government's going to be able to use any of that information to answer some of these questions. We'll wait for the autopsy to get some of those answers and then to start more of the litigation.
Counselor Paul Henderson, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.